I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to the Sweetwater Minute. This time out, our special guest is Jonathan Wyner. Thanks for being here.
Hey, it's good to see you.
Appreciate it. You're a man of many titles.
Yes.
Chief Mastering Engineer at MWorks Mastering.
Correct.
Education Director for Isotope.
Also correct.
And Professor of Music Production and Technology at Berkeley.
Close.
Did I get that?
Music production and engineering.
Well, that's what I meant.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good.
So you're here today on behalf of Isotope.
That's correct.
You were demonstrating Ozone and talking about mastering with our sales engineers.
Yep.
And we thought it'd be great to sit down with you and talk a little bit about what you do and how Ozone factors into that whole process for you. So let's step back. You're a French horn player.
Yep, that's correct. I came up through the entire brass family and ended up with the thorny instrument that is the French horn.
Right.
And graduated with a degree in music performance and composition in French horn, and realized that I just wasn't that good. And so I better find something else to do. So, but that is the genesis of my sort of career in music.
So once you decided to move into a different realm,
Yeah.
then you ended up as a recording engineer, correct?
That's right. I mean, I was always actually really interested in the intersection between music and technology, and tinkered with guitar amplifiers and installing pickups and brass instrument mouthpieces and things like that.
Right.
So, and you know, studied electronic music composition as well, sort of more like the musique concrète sort of kind of composition. And so it's kind of a natural intersection for me. And growing up with, you know, and witnessing the development of technology and the role that it plays in modern pop music production and classical and jazz and so on. So it's always been the thing that really stimulates my brain cells and gets me excited.
Right, right. Now, this is in the Boston area, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I've been in Boston since 1981, which is really, really hard to say out loud, but there you have it.
There you have it, right. What kinds of things were you recording in those days?
Oh, I mean, it was everything from straight up classical music to, you know, it was a few years after that MIDI hit the scene, but experimenting with MIDI and the intersection between MIDI instruments and acoustic instruments. But, you know, what's wonderful about the Boston area is the diversity of music. So we had an early music scene that was second to none, and a gamelan orchestra at MIT, and Berklee College of Music, and what then was the jazz scene, although it's really expanded to be something much more diverse now. And, you know, sort of the new wave scene that was happening back then, and a couple of bands that Amy Mann was in back then, and sort of, you know, just, it was a wonderful intersection and cross-pollination between lots of different musical styles.
Right.
And that's always been what's kept me sort of happy and excited about being in Boston.
Yeah, right, right. So how did you make the move into mastering?
So I worked as a producer and as an engineer until 1985, 86, and it was just kind of dumb luck. I was offered a job in a mastering studio, and this was right around when the compact disc was becoming a reality, a thing.
Sure.
And so digital mastering was this new, shiny, you know, sort of technology. And it was a bit like a magic trick to just capture 2 channels of digital audio, much less EQ it or compress it or edit it or do anything like that. And so I got in on the ground floor, as it were, learned about this new technology, and as a result of that, came in contact with some wonderful projects by famous artists who are interested in exploring, you know, for financial gain and other reasons, this new technology, and so that's where it started for me.
Right, right. How did you learn the process?
I had a mentor named Dr. Toby Mountain at Northeastern Digital Recording, and he really sort of bought wholeheartedly into digital audio technology, I think really before it was fashionable. And there were things about digital audio back then that were less than attractive. The quality of the converters wasn't great. The resolution of the digital bus, as it were, wasn't great. But there were some things that were kind of amazing about it. And we did what we could to make it work for us, even in those early days. Right. And as a result of that embrace of the new technology, as I said, you know, there were artists who were very sort of interested in and friendly to new technology. So we ended up working on remastering a bunch of Frank Zappa records. And he had an engineer named Bob Stone, and they had a synclavier direct-to-disc system, and they would sort of remaster all of his records in digital form and pass them along to us, and we're very sort of clear about, you know, we want to sort of keep this in this realm and get it out into the world, and ended up remastering all of the David Bowie catalog from Man Who Sold the World all the way through Scary Monsters. And sort of projects of that ilk.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Nirvana, Bruce Springsteen.
That's right. That's right. There was a little
wide range of people there.
Yeah, it was sort of Nirvana before they were Nirvana.
Right.
But I did a bunch of work for Sub Pop Records when they started, and yeah, the Springsteen work was in the collection of the Bill Graham concert recordings. So some very early concerts of his, and it's kind of an amazing sort of list of, you know, characters, musicians, bodies of work that cross my desk.
Right. At this point, something like 6,000 CDs you mastered?
Something like that. I decided to stop counting. I figured when the number got to be sufficiently large, it was like, you know.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. That's a very impressive resume, though.
Well, it's great, and what I love is the fact that I've come in contact with that much music and been able to sort of be part of and assist bringing the music to audiences.
Right.
It's really satisfying.
And that's gotten you a Grammy nomination, and some of your projects have won Grammys?
Well, that's right. The projects have won Grammys. I was nominated actually as a producer of a concert DVD that we produced in 2006 with the Grand Rapids Symphony Orchestra. Yeah, it's been wonderful and wonderfully diverse.
Right, right.
Yep.
You have a few firsts, if you will.
Yes.
You mastered the first opera that was recorded.
That's right. So it was recorded by the BBC in 1912. It was Madame Butterfly, which is not too terribly long, but even at that, back then, the way that they would record them is they had two gramophone recorders, which were, you know, the acoustic horns feeding cutting stylus.
Right.
And each side would only hold 7 minutes of audio. So they would have two of them recording, and when one was about 4 minutes in, they would start the next one, so there would be some overlap between them. And it took 27 sides to record the entire opera. The transcription platters lived, for some reason, in the National Archive of New Zealand. And so they asked me if I would figure out a way to put it together as one continuous program from beginning to end, which was kind of an amazing challenge, because the frequency response of the recording from actually the inner groove to the outer, which is how those platters played, changed dramatically. And so I had to figure out some way of making the transition from one to the next seamless and make it sound like one complete recording, soup to nuts. It was also back in the day before we had Isotope RX or, you know, any of the modern noise reduction tools. And but we did have some early noise reduction tools which took forever to use, and it was very tedious and painstaking. So it took me weeks and weeks to make that happen.
I bet. What a cool project, though.
It was very cool. It was very interesting, and it was, you know, like a window, I felt like a time traveler.
Yeah. Right. You've also worked on some interactive CD-ROM games.
That's right. Yeah.
And I read you have the credit as the longest CD ever put onto a.
I think that's now been surpassed.
Has it really?
But at the time, Razor made records. Yeah. So the CD spec allows for 74 and change, 650 megabytes, and we were pushing the boundaries of the 80-minute boundary, and but it gets to the point where, you know, at least with that format, you know, we were constrained by the pitch between the grooves, and the spacing in the, you know, between the pits, and it was hard to get much more than sort of 79 and change, and we sort of had to go through multiple pressings to get this thing to finally play. But we made it for Razor Made Records. It was a dance record at the time, so you know, more is better in that case.
So you've gone there from an early opera to dance music to David Bowie to Nirvana. As a mastering engineer, do you have to change your approach when you're working in these different styles, or do you come in with well, tell us how you approach that.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting subject for me. On one hand, you know, anything that we do with music has to be done within the context of the music. So different music, the thing that makes different kinds of music or styles of music come alive is different. You know, with classical music, dynamic range is expressed by real sort of visceral, big changes in you know, how much sound pressure is coming at you through the air from one moment to the next. Whereas in pop music, dynamic range is, oh, there's a new instrument in the chorus, but the meter doesn't move very much. And so, you know, understanding the association, you know, the connection between the musical style and what's happening technically in the recording is really, really important. Having said that, you know, dynamic range is dynamic range. EQ is EQ, tone is tone. And so a lot of the basic sort of knowledge and use of tools and understanding really doesn't change that much. And sometimes I get a kick out of it when I realize that, you know, a great heavy metal record shares certain characteristics from the standpoint of dynamics with classical music. You know, allowing the transient peaks to really sort of have a wider excursion so that the kick drum, you know, sort of is sharp and excites that much air. If you try to limit it or compress it too much, you end up losing what makes metal work, and the same thing is true of classical music. So, you know, it's kind of cool how, on some level, music and music technology is a single language, and then it sort of cuts across all these different genres.
Right. So when you have a project come in, it's a genre you haven't worked in a while, or something fresh. Do you have recordings you use to calibrate your ears, or how do you get yourself so that you're referencing properly? Yeah,
that's also it's a great question, and it's hard to remain, especially with like modern pop music and subgenres. It seems like we have a new subgenre every day. It's hard to stay current with everything. So you have to rely on your calibration to your room and to what you know, but to some extent I rely on clients as well, you know, and I'll say to them, so, you know, talk to me about sort of what you want out of this, and is there something that you think I should hear to get a sense of what's going on in your, you know, what your record's going to be compared to. So, and certain kinds of music are durable and don't change that much, but some are sort of, you know, a little bit new under the sun.
Right, right. You mentioned in an interview that one of the reasons you find mastering interesting is that you feel it's closely related to music arranging.
Yes.
Tell us what that means.
Well, I think in order to do a good job mixing and mastering, you have to understand musical arrangement. And you have to understand, you know, when an instrument comes in a chorus, what's it supposed to be doing, and where is it supposed to live in proportion to some other instrument, you know? And so I don't think you can do sort of justice or service to the music without that, without having an appreciation for and being kind of dialed in to the musical arrangement.
Right.
I also think that sometimes there are challenges that were presented as mastering engineers that are presented because there's something problematic in the arrangement that wasn't taken care of in mixing. And if nothing else, it's important to realize that I may not be able to fix this in mastering, because the problem exists because there are so many mid-range, you know, horns that are voiced within a minor third of each other playing at the same time. I can't possibly make it so that you can hear the trumpet distinct from the alto sax. You know, it's just not going to happen. So let's not try. You know, there's a kind of an associated caveat, which is if you find yourself trying to remix something in mastering, you're probably going to mess it up.
So at that point, then, do you send it back to the mix engineer and ask for a change, or do you just live with it?
If possible, but you know, mastering sort of lives in this weird seam between the moment you start recording and the moment of distribution. And so someone will come up with a budget of time and money, and you know, this is the period for recording, this is the period for mixing, this is the period for mastering, except the mixing took a little longer, it took a little longer, it took a little longer, and it's like, oh, by the way, the master has to be out tomorrow.
Right.
And so sometimes we just have to do what we can. But in certain instances, the best case is always to come up with the best mix that you can and not rely on mastering to fix the mix.
Right.
Or fix the arrangement, but...
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you do, at the mastering stage, do you ever do edits to change an arrangement around, or to...
Well, when you're thinking about song structure, I mean, sometimes there are requests for that, or, you know, there's only so much we can do in mastering because we do have something that's already baked into a mix, hopefully. I mean, sometimes we'll work with stems, but that's sort of another subject. You know, every so often I'll ask a question out loud, or I'll say something like, boy, that introduction seems very long, or, you know, I wish that the chorus came in a little bit sooner, or something like that, and maybe we'll try to kind of restructure things. And sometimes we make alternate versions. You know, there might be a radio version and the extended version of a track. But it's reasonably rare. It's not sort of an everyday activity.
Right, right. Do you, tell us how you prefer to receive a project. Do you like to see it as files over the internet? Do you like it to have fades already in place? Do you like it to be normalized? How do you like to see the project?
Let's see if I can remember all three of those and do them one at a time.
I can ask again.
Yeah, great. Over the internet, sure. Actually, I mean, I love the fact that I love Dropbox, you know, or whatever the sort of FTP utility is that people are using. It's just enormously handy for somebody to send me a record, and it shows up in the inbox of all my machines and it's ready for me. You know, and I remember the day when I was waiting for the FedEx to show up, and maybe it didn't, and you know, somebody's flying in from North Carolina or whatever, and there goes the day.
Right.
So there used to be a lot of concern about sort of audio purity across the internet, if you will, and fidelity. I, by and large, don't buy any of that. I think it's just fine. Thank you very much. I like to get, you know, the files in their original sample rate and the, you know, the widest bit depth that the stuff was mixed in, the audio was mixed in. So that answers that question, I guess.
Sure.
As far as fades, in general, I love it when people leave the beginnings and ends wide open unless there's something unusual about a fade that they really want to execute on their own. But otherwise, it doesn't take very long to top and tail tracks, as we put it in mastering. And I'd rather sort of wait to the last minute to make those decisions. You know, once you chop something off, you can't get it back.
Right.
Or at the very least, it can delay something by a period of time. And I enjoy the art of fading, you know, especially if we're working on a record where there's some flow between tracks.
Sure.
And having a chance to have some input into that.
Sure. And if you start doing it in dynamics processing, it's going to affect how those fades are shaped.
Well, that's for sure. That's right. And if you fade before you compress, for instance, now you're going to have something interesting happening during the fade out.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
And then your third question, there's no reason to normalize. Print your level where it is and leave it there. I mean, like, if you normalize something, especially if it's peak normalizing as opposed to average level or RMS normalization, it's going to scale it to 0. I won't have any headroom. And so I'm going to have to turn it back down again. So don't bother. Nope. Right.
Do you like to see the peaks at -6, -10? Where do you like to see them?
You know, I'll give you a wide range of -3 to -10 or something like that. If you print mixes too low, and there has to be a lot of gain applied during the mastering process, you hear it. I mean, it's not sort of the most transparent process. And I'm talking about, you know, 2, 3, 4 bits worth of gain.
Right.
You know, talking about like 24 dB or something like that. But otherwise, we've got so much dynamic range at this point in digital audio that there's no reason to push the level all the way up to 0. So peaks there. I really appreciate it when people still use the sort of 0 VU concept where they're mixing to an average level. So back in the day with analog, you know, 0 VU was somewhere around 20 dB below full scale. You give yourself 20 dB of headroom, which was plenty of headroom for allowing dynamics to happen. And so I think that understanding and that practice has kind of fallen by the wayside as people started to use digital meters more. But I think it's a valuable practice. Right.
And we had a bit of a side journey there with 16 bits because everyone was pushing everything as high as they could to get the resolution out of it. And now we don't have that problem anymore. With
that's correct.
Files,
that's correct.
So, right. So speaking of then and now,
yes.
The gear that you use has to have changed pretty substantially in some ways.
Yes, I think it does. I think actually the state of analog and digital has gotten better, and I do use both. But you know, everything that we do in DSP these days is just zillions of light years better than what we used to have. I use a combination of DSP-based tools. Some of it's still in hardware. You know, the Daniel Weiss boxes, you find them in most high-end mastering rooms. 48-bit fixed point processing. I mean, they're still just lovely and lovely to interact with and perform on, if you will. But I do use plugins both on the front end of my chain and the back end of my chain. And then when it's called for, sometimes I'll do things entirely in the box. And sometimes I'll incorporate a round trip through my converters and my analog gear when I think it's going to benefit the project.
And that's something you decide by ear, or do you just have a sense of when you hear something that, you know what, this is going to sound good if I use an analog limiter on it?
Well, both. I mean, yes, it's by ear, and there's always a little bit of experimenting. You know, you go into every project thinking that you know what the answer is going to be, but, you know, I would feel irresponsible if I didn't challenge my assumptions in every instance. And so, you know, one of the things that I think lives at the heart of good mastering, certainly, is A/B comparing all along the way and making sure that you're not just doing something by rote, you know, by habit, and making sure that the trade-off, because inevitably there are going to be trade-offs when you change things, that they make things better and that the trade-offs are justified.
Right, right. So speaking of the new digital tools, you are Director of Education at Isotope. What does that mean? What do you do there?
Yeah, so I'm involved in education. I think to some extent it's both inward and outward facing. So within in my work in the company, I get to work with lots of really, really smart young people who are good at things and know more about things, than I do. Whether it's about programming or DSP modeling of analog processes and that sort of thing. But I get to feed back based on my years of experience and listening, and also to some extent ergonomics and so on around product design. Mm-hmm. And I worked with one of our DSP engineers around the development of the new tape module that's in Ozone 7, sort of thinking a little bit about what tape does and making sure that got expressed in the plugin. So there's sort of, I don't know if that's teaching per se, but there's an educational aspect in terms of how I interact with the development of the products. Mm-hmm. And we actually have a wonderful culture at the company where we have tech talks on a regular basis. So we get together ideally once a week. Every so often we're so busy we have to skip a week, where, and sometimes I'll get up and sort of talk about something related to the work that I've done, and vice versa. So there's a great culture of learning there. Mm-hmm. And then the sort of outward-facing stuff is kind of expressing the value that, we believe in education, that we want, part of the reason for making the products that Isotope makes is to help people do better work. And the tools aren't the thing that does the work, it's the people using the tools, so education has got to be a part of that. Mm-hmm. And I will also say that the Ozone in particular, for me, was a wonderful teaching tool when I first discovered it, and it attracted me to it. And so I think that because the tools are so capable and so flexible, I can use them, in that effort, in that activity. So I get to go around and talk about this sort of area of my domain expertise, about mastering and how the tools will help you achieve, what you're after. So it's not so much about product as it's about doing better work. Mm-hmm. So in that, we've made an online ear training module, Pro Audio Essentials, so that's sort of one piece that I've been involved with. I did a little bit of preset programming for Ozone, sort of to express some things that I think are important to understand about some principles of mastering. I've helped with writing the mastering guide, and then also going around and giving workshops about mastering. And I think I've probably left out like 5 or 6 other things that I'm doing that fall under that umbrella. Right. So we have a great content team at the company with some talented and experienced people, and so we're all collaborating, working on making all this stuff for people together. And the hope and belief is that it will help people do better work, and that's part of the mission of Isotope, if you will.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned Ozone. We have it running here on your MacBook Pro.
Yep.
So there are kind of 2 ways you can use Ozone. You can use it standalone,
yes,
or you can use it as plugins within a DAW.
That's right.
Which way do you recommend that somebody work with Ozone in that situation, if they're going to master their own music?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you're doing. If you've got a single track, and many people don't even necessarily know that it is its own application, mm-hmm. And it can be run in standalone mode. If you've got a track, a mix that's already in really good shape and it just needs to be breathed on a little bit, or touched up a little bit, it's actually kind of handy to be able to open the track up into Ozone, do all of the processing there that you need, and then export it from there. It's a pretty efficient and facile workflow in that case. Right. But if you need to do a lot of editing, a project where you're going to be doing a lot of crossfades between tracks, if you're mastering a full album, you can compare individual tracks within the standalone version, but it's not as facile as a full-blown digital audio workstation is. So in that case, I think you really need to use it within the context of a DAW as a plugin. There are also, each of the individual modules can be broken out into component plugins, so you can just use your sort of favorite module. I find the EQ to be incredibly versatile and kind of it's always present in my toolbox on any given day in the course of my work. And the same is true of the maximizer. Some of the other modules are more sort of specific to certain kinds of sessions, so I might not have them present all the time. But it's nice to have just the component plugs so you're not looking at the whole thing. But the mothership VST, as we call it, the that can sit on your 2-mix and allow you to do either some mix bus processing or to do some mastering, is probably the most common use for most people.
Okay, so in the DAW, right on the
That's
2-mix, right? Mm-hmm.
That's right.
All right. So one of the challenges that I hear from people when they're trying to do mastering at home or in a project studio or in a commercial studio for that matter is, how do I get the bass right? How do I get the treble right? How can Ozone help them with that?
Well, there are a bunch of tools you can use within Ozone to help you measure what's in the spectrum. There's in the spectrum you can actually define the period of audio that accumulates into the spectrum to let you see what's happening. So you can either get a momentary view or an average, a sort of a VU or RMS view of what's going on in the spectrum, which allows you to see things like, how far above the average level the kick drum transient is rising, or where in the treble the sibilance is rising and how far above the average spectrum. But you can also accumulate sort of a picture of the spectrum over time, which will give you a general sense of where you might have imbalances in the program. There's an EQ match facility that allows you to compare what you're creating against a target. I think those are very helpful tools to sort of get a general understanding of how what your music relates to something else or compares to something else. I find them to be useful to a point. But beyond that, given that, music is as varied as there are, people, in a sense, that we have to be careful to not be slavish, to follow too literally what the contour of one track is to compare another. So I'm a firm believer that, your monitoring chain, and getting that right is probably the most important thing. And then the kind of diagnostic tools that you have within Ozone can kind of help you with verification of what you're hearing.
Right. So to get started with our project, someone would load, say, a song into Ozone, and then do you start applying EQ? Do you start compressing first, or how do you get rolling with the process?
Well, you start listening, right? So you want to listen to a project, and there are sort of two things you need to understand at the very beginning. You listen to a track that someone's given you or a record, and develop a sense or an impression of what it sounds like. That's such a general statement, but, how much treble is there versus bass? Can you hear the vocal well? What do you like about the track? One of the things I always remind my students is, if there's something you love about a track, make note of it, because you don't want to lose that by the time you're done, and we get so sort of wound up in the processing and our ego about how good we are at EQing or compressing that it's easy to lose track of what's awesome about what you're hearing. So, hold on to that. So you're trying to assess what you've got, and you need to understand where you're going to go, right? So you need to understand things about level, and this is a big deal, and we've all heard this sort of loudness wars phrase, but there are different target levels that we need to work to depending on the distribution, the output at the end of the day. So if it's going to go to CD, or if it's going to go to iTunes, or if it's going to go to vinyl, or if it's going to go to loudness normalized platforms like YouTube, or Spotify, or Tidal, or add to the list, we have to work to a different level, and that means different decisions. And so at the very beginning, you have to sort of look at what you've got and where you're going to go, and start to build a map about how you're going to get there. So that incorporates the technical considerations I'm talking about and the musical ones. If I'm going to get from point A to point B, am I going to be able to maintain the bounce of the kick drum? Or what can I do to manage the low end so I'm not destroying the kick drum before the thing gets to my limiter at the end? Right. So I think it's really important to sort of map the sort of the A and the B, and think about how you're going to get there, and then identify what the challenges are that are going to be presented in getting there, and think about what tools you're going to use that are going to be best at helping you sort of complete that journey, right? I mean, if you have dynamic range sort of issues, whether they're broad spectrum or they're just in the bass or something like that, you start thinking about, okay, do I need to compress? What sort of compressor do I need to use? Is it frequency specific, or is it broadband? If you've got a tonal issue or a timbral issue with a track. You know, now you're thinking about EQ. You know, is it something that's global? Is it something, you know, maybe I can't hear the vocal quite as well as I would like. Maybe I pull up an EQ just in the mid-band and bring out a little bit of presence. But first start with, like, what do I hear and what do I need to address? And then find the technological solution to help you address it. And so that's, I mean, that's why having such a broad set of tools and being able to do so many different kinds of things is helpful, because, you know, whatever the issue is, now you can sort of pick from the menu and select the right tool to address the problem. Right,
and then there are presets to help you kind of get started as well?
Yeah, presets is an interesting subject. I think sometimes they get a bad rap. Because I think people have the notion, the idea that in some sort of automated way you should be able to hit a preset and it's going to make your music sound like X. And that's just not right. There's no way, you know, again, every track is different. The tone of it's different. The person who's mixed it is different. And the style, you know, so if you hit a reggae preset, you know, on any tool, well, which reggae track are you talking about? The one that has too much bass or too little bass? We know we want some bass, right? So presets are cool in that they give you a sense of what might be possible. You can pull up some presets and say, oh, that's an interesting idea. Let me now sort of see if I can recreate this but scale it to my track or make it work for my track. But I think in mastering, I wouldn't recommend sort of using a preset sort of, you know, in its entirety. As a mix engineer, it's a slightly different thing, in the same way that, you know, for people who like to put a compressor on a mix bus, you're mixing into that compressor. And so you're winding the compression into your mix, right? And they're sort of dancing together.
Right.
And it's actually a little bit challenging, because if you turn the compressor off, your mix might fall apart, depending on how involved you are with the compressor. So, you know, you can pull up a preset, put it on your mix bus and mix into it. Just be aware that that may be, you know, a marriage that will be forever, in perpetuity in your track, you know. There's no divorce here.
Yes, you
know?
can't unburn that.
That's right. That's right.
Cooked in at that point.
Yep, that's right.
Right. So generally then, do you work from a broader picture? Do you begin by doing your EQ shaping on the overall mix? Or do you start by saying, you know, there's too much 120 hertz and I need to dial that back, and then do your broad shaping afterward? Or is either of those a set process for you?
It's not set. I think I would say that I start with corrective moves. Okay, so if there's something that's out of whack, that's kind of a broad issue. You know, it's just too dark, you know, or it's got too much low end. I know I've got to fix that. I've got to deal with that before I can do anything else. You know, if you've got a huge bump in the bass and you try to compress the track, you know, you're in trouble, because the compressor's going to pump like crazy, no matter what you do. So I start with corrective moves. I think that's the way I would put it, whether they're broad or narrow. And then from there, it's kind of a dance. You know, you're trying to think both zoomed out and zoomed in simultaneously. You're paying attention to the general sense of the track and making sure that there isn't some little resonance or some collision or clash or some masking that's taking place that you can't deal with a little bit of a spot EQ in some part of the spectrum. You know, sometimes we're addressing different parts of a track differently. You know, we might do a little something different to a chorus or a verse, or change the gain staging a little bit between parts of a mix. But there's no sort of rote, you know, script, you know, about exactly how it's going to go. But I think I would stand by this sort of, I probably start with the corrective move and thinking about level first. Those are the two sort of parts of the equation that are going to get me most quickly to the end result, right? And then any of the more nuanced sorts of work that sort of happen in the middle, in between the input and the output, if you will, that occupies the rest of the time and the rest of the process. And at some point, you have to be done, you know? So you have to you also have to prioritize the work. I mean, you have to, and this is also something I say to my students, is when you first hear a track, I mean, if you're mastering your own music, it's challenging to do this. But if you can sort of walk away and come back 3 days later, and that moment when you hear it for the first time, just make some notes about what you want to do. And that should be the highest priority sort of items on your list to achieve. And if that's all you accomplish, if it's just, this sounds a little dull, or something like that, or it sounds too bright, or whatever the thing happens to be, and you can satisfy that, that's awesome. And then, if the triangle was a little bit too hot in the third chorus, and, but you realize that if you try to de-ess the triangle, you're screwing up the background vocals, just let it go. Because that's not on your initial list, right? That's not sort of top of the list.
Right.
Right.
So if there were one thing that you could say, if everybody would just stop doing this, my life as a mastering engineer would be so much better, or one common problem that you see over and over again, what would that be?
Well, the common problem is getting the low end right, which is really, really challenging. Because, the thing that makes it challenging is that it's all about the monitoring a chain, which is a lot about architecture and room acoustics, and that's expensive to fix. And it's not that we don't know how to make good sounding rooms, but most people can't justify it.
Right.
So that's, and there are some tools out there like spectrograms and spectral displays, and we actually were just thinking about another tool, which we may or may not develop at Isotope to help people with this. But there are digital room correction tools and things like that that are out there. But that's the tough one.
Right.
The other thing I would say is stop guessing. I've heard people say, well, gee, I should really make sure that my mix is wetter than I want because it'll get drier in mastering. Or I want to make sure it's drier than I want because it'll get wetter in mastering. Or I want it to be, this because that's going to happen. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's, doing anything based on guesswork, whether it's, I'm listening on NS10s, so I'm going to add enough bass until my NS10s distort, because I'm guessing that that's right. You don't want to rely on guesswork. Get it as good as you can. Like, as good as you can. That doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, but get it as good as you can and then hand it off. And not to sort of undersell mastering engineers' work, or my work, but the one record that I worked on, which won the Stereophile Record of the Year, was a record where I did virtually no EQ. It was a symphonic recording, and it was just gorgeous. And it won the award, and now I have that on my resume, so it made me look good. So, I mean, if I get stuff coming in that sounds great, it's great. It's just satisfying all around. When Bob Clearmountain mixes a record that I get to master, it's awesome. I mean, it's really challenging to make it any better, but that's awesome.
Right.
That's great.
Right, yeah, that's tough.
Yeah. So the, the guesswork is, I think, I mean, we all sort of have to do it. We're always second guessing ourselves and whatever, but I think that sort of, that's a way to end up with something better, I think is quite the opposite.
Right. Part of that, I think, is being able to be objective, especially if you're working on your own music.
Yes.
Because when you get so close to it, you get so dialed in and you're anticipating and hearing it the way you want to hear it or the way you think you should hear it. I think that makes it harder to be...
It's so hard. You're so right. You're so right. And I think it's a challenge. I think the collaboration that gets lost when we're sort of working in a siloed way, and we are the recording engineer, the arranger, the mixer, the mastering engineer, and maybe the record label,
Right.
We don't have those other bits of feedback and the opportunity to collaborate. I'll tell you a silly thing that sometimes I suggest to people, which is, it's not that silly actually. So if you're in the middle of a mix and want to get a sense of what it might sound like to somebody else, or to sort of get out of your head, invite somebody else to come in the room, sit down, but not say anything. And just by having somebody else come and sit with you, I think it just reorganizes your brain cells. You're suddenly aware of them, and you get a little bit of a perspective kind of through that, third person.
Right. Yeah, you definitely do. I've had the experience where I've sat down to play music for someone, and as it goes along, you're thinking, oh, they're getting bored now. I can tell they're getting bored
right,
now. I have to change that part.
Exactly.
I have to make an edit there or something like that. So,
and that's really
advice.
invaluable.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Jonathan, thanks for coming in.
It's my great pleasure.
Appreciate you spending time with us and sharing your wisdom and all these tips and things. Wonderful stuff. And Ozone, of course, is an incredible tool.
Well, I'm glad you like it.
So powerful for making mixes shine, if you will, when you're working on things. So thanks very much. Hope you come back. Spend some more time with us.
I will be.
Absolutely.
So
Look forward to it.
Appreciate it.
I'm Mitch Gallagher. Thanks for joining me for the Sweetwater Minute.